Nationalism Month. We've been focusing this month on the threat of Christian nationalism, why it's bad for democracy, why it's bad for Christianity, and what we can do about it. We've been launching a number of initiatives from podcasts to in-person gatherings. Doug is traveling again. He's in Washington, D.C., talking with a group of pastors and activists about this issue. He just got back from England, where Vote Common Good hosted and participated in a symposium at Oxford University on the global threat of Christian nationalism. And we've also just launched a podcast this month. It's called Confronting Christian Nationalism. You can search for that wherever you get your podcasts. You can ask Alexa to play it, and hopefully she'll listen if you ask nicely. But you can get this podcast anywhere. We hope you'll subscribe and like and share and all those things. It really helps because we think this is an important topic. And more people need to understand this problem and try to do something about it. So we've got this podcast. A lot of the content from this podcast comes from live events we did in the lead up to the 2022 election. And so we thought during this month of Confronting Christian Nationalism, why don't we play you one of those events from the road? And so we're going to play you one of our live events that we hosted. It's from McFarlan, Wisconsin, which is up near Madison. And this is a church that hosted us because a lot of churches are realizing that Christian nationalism isn't this fringe thing. It's not this innocuous thing that we don't need to worry about, but it's something that we need to talk about, understand, and confront. And so today's show will be going back to 2022 in October. From McFarlan, Wisconsin. This is our Confronting Christian Nationalism live event. And you can find more of these and our complete curriculum for individuals and churches over at our YouTube channel. And we hope you check that out as well.
All right, we're going to talk about Christian nationalism tonight, and we're going to use this screen a lot. Going to kind of walk you through what's going on. I mentioned my name is Doug, and I've been a pastor for my entire adult life. I came from the kind of religious tradition where people just put you in leadership right away. So I didn't grow up in religion or anything, but when I was 16 years old, I got into Christianity, started leading things in high school, and then went to college and started working at a church and was a pastor when I was in college. And so I've been doing this stuff my whole adult life. And never did I think we would have to travel the country and say to people, would you consider faith, hope, and love and not insurrections and Christian nationalism? Now, I have to tell you, we do this work. We travel the country. We try to get faith voters to make the common good their voting criteria, especially people who feel like their faith connected them to a political identity that kind of came like ordering the number 2 at Wendy's and you just got the fries with the combo meal. And you say you're not going to eat the fries, but we all eat the fries, and they're gone by the time you get home. And so some people want to keep their faith, but not keep the same political identity. So we help voters do that. That's the work we do. We try to give them a sense of agency and a sense of commonality. But tonight we're not talking so much about that. We're talking about something much bigger. We're talking about this impact of Christian nationalism in the United States. 3, 4, 5 years ago, maybe 2 years ago, maybe 18 months ago, I was saying things like, look, let's not worry too much about Christian nationalism. It's fringy. It's not the masses. They're never going to really do anything. Don't stir it up. It's sort of, like asbestos tiles in the church, when you decide to put new flooring down, you're like, look, if you don't pop them up, then maybe they'll be okay, right? Just keep away from it. Turns out that's not the case anymore. If I was ever right, I'm not right now. I wasn't right about that now. What I think happened on January 6th, what I think happened over the last 4 years is the spawning of a new breed of Christian nationalism. We've always been afraid of it. We were afraid of it when it was the KKK in those Christian nationalist movement. We were afraid of the Christian nationalist movements in the 1920s and the 1910s, afraid of them in the 1840s and the 1820s. We were afraid of them in the 1770s. But there's a new version that's alive now. Because ideas like this, more sort of like the pandemic, sort of like the novel COVID-19 virus, doesn't behave like the other viruses. Remember when we learned from Anthony Fauci that in all the people who studied epidemiology, they didn't think viruses like that ever transmitted from one person to another without someone having symptoms. Remember that back in January of 2020? They're pretty confident if you don't have symptoms, you're okay. That's why people were acting the way we were acting. Then they found out, no, this virus acts differently. It does spread in that was a big mind shift for people. The modern version, the 2021 to 2022 version of Christian nationalism that is alive in this world, it's a new variant. I think it's more dangerous and it spreads more easily. You're going to see a bunch of that tonight. Now, we've been working on this in our organization for a couple of years because after the insurrection, we did an online series of courses for people to watch with experts in the area of Christian nationalism. You're going to see some of those videos. We took those videos, we edited them into a way that churches or individuals can have an online curriculum or a video curriculum with a PDF curriculum guide with them. And now we're taking this on the road. 4 months ago, we didn't know we were going to be doing these events. We thought we'd be traveling the country asking faith voters to make the common good their voting criteria and call for faith, hope, and love for a change on Election Day, right? And then it became clear, we not only need to have that message, but we need to have the message we're going to talk about tonight, which is the threats of Christian nationalism. So I don't know what's brought you here, but I can tell you what brought us here, and that is we think this stuff is serious and is a real thing. We're going to try to accomplish these three things tonight. We're going to try to talk about what is Christian nationalism, what can churches do, and what can individuals do. It's our deep hope that you leave here with less anxiety and more empathy, that you leave here with less anger and more engagement. That's what we're hoping comes out of tonight. We're going to show you a lot of video of people who hold Christian nationalism views. I'm going to work really hard as the prime presenter tonight to not overstate Christian nationalist views and to never red herring them, to never talk in such a way that makes it sound worse. I have friends who are Christian nationalists. I've checked as much as I can the content I'm going to share with you tonight with them because I want them to feel like what we're going to talk about tonight, they would say, you've got us right. That is what we say. That is what we believe. Christian nationalism in the United States is so potent, so popular, and so dangerous, we don't have to overstate it for emphasis. We can say it as it is. So if my friends were sitting here, who are Christian nationalists, I'd want them to say, yeah, that's right, you got us. The people you're going to see on the screen, we're trying to give them as much time and energy as we can. So that's my commitment. That's what I want to do. Hopefully we can get there tonight and that we can fully understand and hear this. Because what I hope you'll come away with is that you have a deeper sense of what Christian nationalism is so that you feel confident thinking about it and talking about it with others. I don't know about the rest of you, but you may have felt like I did sometimes. We're like, Christian nationalism, totally against it. Not so sure what it is. You know, it's like the monkeypox virus. Like, I don't really know what that is, but I don't want it, right? I don't know what the symptoms are. I don't know what it looks like, but I heard it on the news and I don't want monkeypox. We want you to leave here more engaged, more informed, with a deeper level of understanding about this. Some things need to be said in 1 word, some things in 10 words, some things in 100 words, right? Sometimes you need a 1-word answer, but sometimes you need to take a little time and spend 100 words on it. It's one of the things we learn in our lives. When someone says, do you love me? You don't give them the 100-word answer. It just doesn't go over well, right? Like, you don't start with, it's complicated and there are things, and you know the way I grew up. But Christian nationalism might require a 100-word response. It might require a 10-word response. It might require a 1-word response. Not Christian nationalism. But we also want to be able to say more than that. So we want to help you feel confident in a 1-word, a 10-word, and a 100-word sort of response to it. So that's some of our commitment tonight. Here's a working assumption. Christian nationalism is real, and it is worrisome. We're going to show you some clips tonight. This first bit comes from MSNBC. It's a special that I saw about 3 weeks ago. One of the reasons we decided to start doing these events. If you're saying to yourself, wow, I didn't even know this thing was happening. Like, fortunately, Brian sent an email or somebody from the conference office sent an email or I saw something on Facebook. I didn't even know this was happening 2 weeks ago. We didn't know this was happening 2 weeks ago. We came up with this driving in the vehicle around the country that we're going to put these presentations together. Partly because it was becoming so evident to us that we have to take a more direct response to this. In other words, we can't do just a 10-word conversation about Christian nationalism. We need, and it'll be more than 100 words tonight. I think you get the point. I saw this special a couple weeks ago on MSNBC. It was an hour-long special about a person who ran for Congress in the 34th Congressional District of Texas, which is down on the southern border near Halligan, Texas. And she won her election in June. It was a special election, one of those ones that a person couldn't fulfill their term, so she ran. And Representative Flores won that election. And she won it on a campaign called Make America Godly Again. And it came out of a church in partnership. You're going to see all those stories. When we were on a bike ride across the United States, we rode from San Diego, California, a year ago at this time, from San Diego, California, along the entire U.S.-Mexico border, and then across the coast to Florida to document the story of immigration and what's really happened. There's a little card in there to tell you about that tour that we were on. We went through this town and we saw all these signs for this person who was running, and because she was running back last fall for the election that was coming in June. And I remember messaging Rob and saying, like, do you know who this person is? Her stuff's all over. And it was all family, God, and values stuff that's out there. And I got really concerned about it. And well, this is a special about her. And also, you're going to see a couple pieces out of this to tell the story. One of the reasons I want to show you this is so you see real people. Because part of our commitment tonight is to create deep empathy. All the people you're going to see on this screen tonight are people in the United States of America, the United States citizens like many of the rest of us, are living in this country, if you're not yet a citizen. They are us. We are them. We are all in this together. The us and them thing, we can't do that game anymore. We might say we have different opinions, we're going to make each other better, or we're going to iron sharpen iron, I don't know, whatever metaphor you want. But we can't say you versus us. All of these people we're going to see are people who are part of America. They are the we of the people. They're not them, they're us, because we're in this together. And if you come from the Christian tradition, as I do, many of these people are advocating Christian positions from their Christian faith, so we also share a faith together. And I might want to say, I don't feel like our faiths are really all that much the same, but they say they're Christian, I say I'm Christian, so we're in that together. So we want you to see these people, to look at them, to know them, to have names, and realize Christian nationalism is not a concept. Christian nationalism is a people movement. And it's that people movement that we think other people need to know about and act on, and we want to bring an end to Christian nationalism in the United States government of the United States. One last comment before we get going. The fear of Christian nationalism is not just what people think. We're not here to go run around and thought police people. We're not going to stop every conversation in a coffee shop where someone says, well, you know, America was founded as a Christian nation, run over there and say, no, it wasn't, and we should have an argument. That's not our work. Our concern is not just what people think, it's what our government does. Our concern is not just what voters are thinking. We're trying to work on that. We want to pull voters. We want to push voters into thinking more about faith, hope, and love. The concern is that the federal government, that the state government, that the county government not utilize Christian narratives as the basis of our legal system. The problem is when ideas become activated in power. So that's what we're primarily concerned about. So much of what you're going to see tonight are from Congress people, from former secretaries of state, from people who are former attorney generals. We want you to hear about that, and then people who are advocating that work. Because the problem is not just that people don't think right, but that we're putting ideas into practice with the force of the government. Okay? So that's going to be our night. You're going to see a lot of this stuff. We're going to see some interviews that we're doing with some people. I'm going to make a bunch of comments in between, but here's the beginning of this conversation about Representative Flores and others in Texas.
Flores is running at a time when Republican candidates around the country have called for religion to play a greater role in government, some of them calling for an end to the separation of church and state, some of them calling for the U.S. to become an explicitly Christian nation.
We need to be the party of nationalism, and I'm a Christian and I say it proudly. We should be Christian nationalists.
The church is supposed to direct the government. The government is not supposed to direct the church. And I'm tired of this separation of church and state junk that's not in the Constitution. It was in a stinking letter, and it means nothing like what they say it does.
We asked Congresswoman Flores for her view of government and religion.
Do you think there should be a separation between church and state?
Well, I believe that the government has no business, getting involved with the church. But I do think that the church does have the right to get involved in the government and letting us know. Because again, I believe that the church knows the people better than the government. And that is a fact. But I agree that the government has no business, getting involved with the church. There has to be a separation.
Train of thought, do you support the United States becoming a Christian nationalist country?
Yeah, I do. I believe that we should always put God first.
Okay, so you heard 3 congresswomen there. One of those was Marjorie Taylor Greene. She is a representative, a duly elected representative in the United States Congress from the state of Georgia. You heard Lauren Boebert giving that sermon. You're going to hear more of that in a little bit. She's the duly elected congresswoman from Colorado, and that's Representative Flores from Texas. These are 3 people, and you'll hear from others, who have a very strong perspective about the role of the government and religion in the United States, and they advocate for Christian nationalism and want us to be a Christian nationalist country. So we're not just saying, if you interpret what some people are saying just right, maybe it's kind of leaning that direction. That's not where we are. So this is the context that we find ourselves in. Now, this video that we're going to show you was shot by a reporter from The New Yorker. This is inside of the Senate chamber on January 6, 2021. This is when the insurrectionists came into the building and took over the Senate dais. These are among the first people in the building, and they pray a prayer, a long prayer, dedicating their work and thanking Jesus for bringing them in, and they declare very boldly what their intention is of the insurrection and why they're in the building. I'll just tell you, if you get triggered by some things like this kind of talk, it's hard to watch. I've watched this many, many times, and it still feels hard to watch sometimes. You're going to see some familiar characters. You might remember a person who became fairly famous from the insurrection. He's often referred to as the QAnon shaman with the horns and the painted face. He's the one leading the prayer. The insurrection is inseparable from the movement of Christian nationalism. There were people part of the insurrection who are not Christian nationalists, but the two have been brought together more like a smoothie than a tossed salad. Not two movements sitting next to each other in a bowl. They've been swirled together in such a way that it's nearly impossible to pull one ingredient flavor out from the other. So you're going to see that. You're going to see that now.
All the way back to the monument of DC.
Jesus Christ, we invoke your name. Amen.
Let's all say a prayer in this sacred space.
Thank you, Heavenly Father, for gracing us with this opportunity. Thank you. Let me take it back. Thank you, Heavenly Father.
Amen.
For this opportunity to stand up for our God-given unalienable rights. Thank you, Heavenly Father, for giving the inspiration needed to these police officers to allow us in this building, to allow us to exercise our rights, to allow us to send a message to all the tyrants, the communists, and the globalists, that this is our nation, not theirs. That we will not allow the American way of the United States of America to go down. Thank you, divine, omniscient, omnipotent, and omnipresent Creator God, for filling this chamber with your white light of love, with your white light of harmony. Thank you for filling this chamber with patriots that love you and that love Christ. Thank you, divine, omniscient, omnipotent, and omnipresent Creator God, for blessing each and every one of us here and now. Thank you, divine Creator God, for surrounding and filling us with your divine, omnipresent white light of love and protection, peace and harmony. Thank you for allowing the United States of America to be reborn. Thank you for allowing us to get rid of the communists, the globalists, and the traitors within our government. We love you and we thank you. In Christ's holy name we pray.
It's disturbing. That's the movement. This is our country, not theirs. Thank you for sending a message. Thank you for the Capitol Police officers that allowed us to come in here today. Thanks for allowing America to be born in the white light of your teaching. All of this is what went on. That is the insurrection. Many of those people are in jail right now for their participation in those actions. Christian nationalism made a choice to become a violent action in the United States on January 6th and beyond. We've known that it's been happening in small parts, but a movement into the federal government's seat of power was intentional, and we think it's particularly dangerous. So we're going to talk about what's some responses to this. How do we understand it? What gets people into that place? It's easy to think they're just wacky, right? It's easy to think, what on earth? You're going to hear some presenters tonight. In fact, some of these people that you're going to hear here in a moment wrote a book called Take America Back for God. They're sociologists that study this stuff very well. They've been great friends of our work and influencers of our work. They will tell you there's just too many people to think that it's just a one-off here and there. You're going to see a video clip of these interviews that we did that are part of our curriculum, and what they suggest, it's Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry, these are the sociologists, and what they suggest from their work is that there's 4 categories of people around Christian nationalism, and they suggest that you think about it on a spectrum. One is rejectors, people who are against Christian nationalism and want to stop it in the United States. I'm in that category, maybe you are too. The resistors, those who are like, Christian nationalism is kind of no good, but I don't know, I don't want to really go out and like stop people. I mean, it's done some good in our country, this kind of thing. Then another category are the accommodators, like, hey, I'm not going to push for it, but I'm also really not going to stop it. And then the ambassadors, the people who are out pushing it, teaching it, leading it. It's a really helpful way to know that there's a spectrum. And individual people might move along that spectrum at different times in their lives in different moments. I think we're in a moment where a lot of people who you'd put in the category maybe even of resistors or accommodators have been moving into the category of being ambassadors. More people talking about it or saying, hey, maybe it's not so bad. Maybe it's a good idea that we have a faith test in the United States. Just for the basic knowledge of Christianity. Since Christianity was a part of the founding of the country, maybe it's a good thing for us to be sure we teach Christianity so people understand how our country came to be. Right, this kind of thing is how it comes forward. So you're going to see this conversation with that we had with Andrew and Sam. What we did 6 weeks of hour-long conversations that then have been broken down into smaller pieces. Stephanie here and Christy there and I were the 3 hosts of this. So you'll see us in a lot of the video clips. All of these are on our website for free. They're also on YouTube for free in a format for you to download. So if you're thinking, well, I'd like to show this with a group or talk to it with a friend or do something, that's what you're seeing here. Everything that looks like this in one way or the other tonight comes from that curriculum, and it's all available for you to take and use. And there's a PDF download, a downloadable PDF for you to take with you in case you're like, wow, I could watch these people, but I don't know what to talk about after that. Well, we have a little discussion guide that's sort of put together for that intention. So this is super helpful. Again, their book is called Taking America Back for God, Christian Nationalism in the United States. I wish their title also said something like Christian nationalism. It's a bad thing, because you see that title and you're not really sure, like, are they advocating for it or are they against it? Okay. They put this out long ago. They've been doing this study for a long time. They've been like the Christian nationalist study people. They're like if you use the pandemic metaphor, they're like the NIH people. They're like, oh, hey, this is our time. We study viruses, like this is our deal. And now everybody cares about our thing, and now they're talking about mRNA vaccines. Wow, that's what we talk about in our world. Right? That's them on the Christian nationalism stuff. They've been on it for a long time. They're sociologists. They both have Christian backgrounds, interestingly, but are really concerned about Christian nationalism, so they study it as professional sociologists out of university. So here they are.
Yeah, definitely. So, thinking too back to that scale that we created, those that are on the very low end, so who strongly disagree with a lot of these questions, we call them rejectors. And so they're the ones that say, we don't really want any sort of close, relationship between this type of Christianity and American civic life. And so then we have resistors. And these are Americans that are a little more undecided. So they don't wholly oppose Christian nationalism or Christianity being a part of the conversation, but they're definitely uncomfortable with it. And then the group, kind of, if you know where the mean is of the scale, right in the middle, the group on the other side of that, from resistors, we call accommodators. And this is the largest group. This is about 30%, a little over 30% of the population in various surveys that we include these questions over and over. So they're the largest group, and they're the ones that, again, don't completely embrace Christian nationalism. But when we talk to them and when we interview people for the book all across the US, our accommodators are those that think, well, Christianity has played a good role in the past. It should be a part of kind of what happens in American civil society. Maybe a little uncomfortable with it being the only religion, but they kind of are like, well, most of us are Christians. And so, yeah, the prayer at the Friday night football game should probably just be Christian. But again, they aren't quite as strongly embracing it. And then you have ambassadors, and they're the ones at the highest end of the scale. And they're the ones that really strongly embrace this idea of the U.S. is a Christian nation, always was, always should be. We have to take it back in order for it to maintain a blessing from the Christian God. And ambassadors are just around 20% of the population. So if we put ambassadors and accommodators together, it's a little over 50% of Americans are at least open to or friendly towards this idea of Christianity being privileged in the public sphere. And so when we look at it in that sense, churches, people kind of self-select in the different churches, but I think most white evangelical or even white mainline churches are going to have a lot of people that are at least somewhat embracing Christian nationalism.
50% would be in the accommodators and ambassador side. It's not a fringe movement. People don't always know what category they're in. What they're going to describe for you in a minute is when they do these studies, they ask people about their views. What do you think about these things? How was America founded? How should we act? And by those answers to those questions, they put them in a category. And then that category makes up 50% of the US population. There are people now going around saying, as Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene said, I'm a very proud Christian nationalist and we should say it out loud. But those are just some people. Others would be like, I don't know if I'd really use that title. You know, it's like saying you're a Midwesterner. Like, you don't really talk about being a Midwesterner, like, unless, I don't know, like you're talking to people about like where you live in the country, or if you're traveling to another country and you're like, I kind of live in the Midwest. It's true you're a Midwesterner, but you don't really use it as your identity, right? You're not like, oh, hey Midwesterner, you know? You might not even say, hey, person from Wisconsin, but you're living in Wisconsin. So there's a lot of people who don't identify as being Christian nationalists, but they're living in it. It is the reality of where they find themselves. They're going to say something here in a moment which is really powerful, which is the power of answering certain questions in a certain way is the prime indicator of how you respond to a lot of other social issues. That the factor, this is sociologists speak, the factor of being recognized on the scale of Christian nationalism is the prime predictor of where you are on a whole series of really important social issues. We might think it's race, we might think it's religion, we might think it's economics, we might think it's where in the country you live. They're suggesting it's how Christian nationalist are you. It's actually the one thing that is a predictor of where you are on other social issues. Which I think is really, really telling, that we might be onto something now. We might be discovering something about the American population through this. Now, this person that you're going to meet here, this is from that same special that we saw about Representative Flores. He's somebody who's organizing work in Latino churches to reach out for candidates and for voters, and you'll hear at the end what he thinks about Christian nationalism.
Can you tell me a little bit more about Bienvenido's Faith Assembly team? How do you all organize?
In 2019, we realized that to better engage and mobilize the Latino voters and to expose the message of conservative policy, the best way to do it was through the churches, because 8 out of 10 times, if a Latino is being outreached through the church, more than likely they believe in some of the conservative platforms, so it's much easier for them to get out and vote Republican.
The Congresswoman started and ended her campaign in the church. How effective was that?
The most effective. Yeah. Myra Flores were able to bring that message to South Texas and say, listen, no more church lockdowns, no more harassment and attacks on the church. Get out and vote for someone that will protect religious liberty. And that's why over, I think, 75, a coalition of over plus 75 churches came together and said, we are supporting Myra Flores through our congregation, letting them know who is running for office.
Is that a new strategy? I mean, is it a new strategy to sort of deploy churches and pastors?
The Democrat Party has been doing that with black churches for years and years and years. And it took outside organizations like Bienvenido to come in and tell churches, hey, it is your right to be involved. So if Republicans don't start strategizing with Latino pastors and churches like the Democrats have done for years with the black church, there will be no victory for conservative candidates across the country.
God, family, and country. Why do you think those 3 words resonated so much?
It is.
With Latinos specifically.
It is the heartbeat of the Latino community. You can't have moral values without having faith in something, faith in having, understanding that God is, your rights come from God and God only, right? So tying those things into
That's a dangerous thing to say, that your rights come from God and God only. What do you mean by that?
Absolutely not. Are you kidding me? Well, I would rather say that my rights come from God than rights come from government. Government can take away my rights. I mean, in the Constitution, we have unalienable rights that come from our Creator, being that we have the opportunity of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That only comes from you understanding that there is a moral conscience, right? And for Latinos, that means believing that our rights come from our God-given rights, come from God and not government. And I think that Congresswoman Maya Flores was able to make that a political campaign.
When I talked to the Congresswoman, she even said that she would support the United States becoming a Christian nationalist country.
Mm-hmm.
Those are her words. Mm-hmm. Do you support something like
100%.
that?
100%.
A lot there, isn't there? There's a lot going on in this conversation. It's an interesting thing saying, hey, if we don't do outreach into Latino churches to convert those people into Republican voters, Republicans aren't going to win again. Christian nationalism is fundamentally a political movement. It's not fundamentally about helping people figure out the way of the world. It's got its roots in a political movement. I think churches should organize around political efforts, no problem. A lot of what he said there, I didn't really have a problem with until it's like, but the goal of it is for the United States to be a Christian nationalist country. The outcome and the goal is not greater democracy and greater inclusion. It is Christian nationalism is the point. That's the piece that's new. That's the piece I think is powerful. Here's a slide of something that's happening right now. So if people are watching online and they'd rather go over to prayvotestand.org, you can. This is a group of people. That guy in the middle is named Tony Perkins. The Family Research Council is a well-funded, conservative, right-wing leaning group. And they're having an event tonight asking the question, the rise of the term Christian nationalism. Where did it come from and why is it being used? Here's what I think is going on with this. This is what they're starting to do now. Now they're going to critique the term. Christian nationalism is just a way to condemn Christians. It's just a thing to be against Christians. It's really just a ruse. Don't worry about Christian nationalism. People are just using it as a derogatory term. So it's interesting that even people on the political right that are there are very few groups that would advocate for Christian nationalist perspective in the federal government more than the Family Research Council. They are hardwired into it. But they're wanting now to push back on the use of the term as a derogatory term, which tells you that in their world and our world, and apparently yours because you're here tonight, this word has bubbled up to the surface where people are caring about it on all the sides. This is good news. It's now in the public sphere and we can talk about it. We can break the no-talk rules. We can start to engage on these issues. Let's take this as good news and that there's some conversation partners in the world where we can start talking about Christian nationalism in maybe a more informed way. Okay, so I would suggest that, and this is part of what we're going to do for a bit of the next section here, that there's 5 different lanes by which people use to get into Christian nationalism. For some people, it's the founding of the country. For some people, it's just a flat-out confusion, intentional or unintentional, about the distinction between church and people. We'll talk about that in a minute. For some, it's seeing the United States as the new Israel. For some, it's the individual and their government question and how do we reconcile what's the role of us. When you heard Representative Flores say, well, I just think we should put God first in our country. She ends up in there because she thinks that's just what people do. People should put God first. So she ends up in it maybe through that role. And then the final is, what's God's ultimate plan in the world? So people come through all of these different lanes, or different doors is probably a better way. They all end up in the same mall, or they end up on the same airplane going to different locations ultimately, but they're in that mall, on that airplane together. So they come from different places. This I have found personally to be very helpful when I'm talking to Christian nationalists to understand which lane, which door, which connecting flight did they come in on? How did they get there? Because they're not all the same. So yes, there's a lot of disagreements among the Christian nationalist movement. Like my friends around there, they're like, oh yeah, I'm out of the whole insurrection thing. Like that was too much for me, I'm out. But they're still supporting, they still see the United States as the new Israel, and that, in other words, what was said to the nation of Israel in the Jewish scriptures is one for one what's said to the United States, that kind of thing, right? Like the United States is the nation of Israel, kind of thing. So there's a whole lot of tumult inside of this world too. They're not all in lockstep, even though it might feel like it sometimes. Okay, so let's jump into this. The church and state question, it's obviously a big one. It's something that a lot of people go back to, and that's why you hear this like separation of church and state. What was the intentions at the beginning? For people who really find a lot of power in origin stories, the question of did the United States intend and start out to be a Christian nation is a really important question. For people that aren't that into origin stories, they don't really care. Like, I don't care if the United States started out as a Christian nation. It should be one now. Or, I don't care if the United States started out with the intention of being a Christian nation. It shouldn't be one now. Right? They just don't care about the origin story. But some people really care about the origin story. So they're having a lot of fights about this. Now look, we haven't known how to talk about faith and religion and government and politics in this country from our founding. We took a bunch of colonies, 13 of them, some which had a very direct religious implication to them. They were founded for religious ideas, but then brought them into the birthing of a new nation that then had to put into the First Amendment not only the freedom of the press and the freedom of speech, but something about religion, because we're figuring it out. It's a difficult thing. We're not done with it. Just because it was written about early on doesn't mean we're done with it. We should say to ourselves, those early arguments, they're never going away, and every generation has to take them on over and over and over again. Are any of you teachers? Elementary school teachers? I think about second grade teachers, and like every year you teach second grade. Like you just get a new batch of second graders every time. How do you do it? They have this like stick-to-itiveness. Every generation like has to go through the conversation about religion, like going through second grade. And the next generation, we can't be like, oh, we settled this years ago. We're done with that question. We figured that out. I mean, it's, it's separation of church and state. That's not how it's going to work, because someone's going to say, well, wasn't that Thomas Jefferson who said that in 1802, writing to the Baptists in Virginia? So maybe it wasn't in the Constitution. Maybe it wasn't a law. And here we go again. So we have to figure out how to have these conversations regularly about the origins. Or you're like, oh my gosh, we're going to talk about this again. I don't care about our founding. Okay? So just know, for some people, the founding is the big question. You'll hear it over and over in some of these people that you're hearing from tonight, but not all of them. So I want to introduce you to, okay, we're going to talk about, you're going to see this little clip here again where Sam Perry says something. No, I'm going to skip that one for tonight. I want to show you this bit from Kristen Stewart. Kristen has written a book called The Power Worshippers: Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism. She told me part of the reason she doesn't call it Christian nationalism is because she's Jewish and she didn't want to be picking on the Christians. That's just not a smart thing to do, she said in her estimation, right? And also she was saying religious nationalism is a broader term than just Christian nationalism. There's religious nationalism all over the world. There's Christian nationalism all over the world. Her daughter, she got into this because she first wrote a book called The Good News Club. Her daughter went to a school where a Christian group had started a thing called the Good News Club. Maybe you're familiar with it, maybe you're not, but they're things for elementary school kids, Christianizing kids in school settings before and after school. Her daughter came home and said, Mom, why am I going to hell? Mom's like, what did you hear at school today? And she said, well, these kids were saying this. She asked around the school, found out it came from the Good News Club content, and she wrote a whole book about what's going on in our public schools and what kind of Christianizing, Christian nationalism being taught. Then she extended that further and writes this exceptional book. If you're a book reader on this stuff, Taking America Back for God, you're going to want that one. This one, The Power Worshippers, indispensable in your library if this is something that you're into. So she really details the system behind Christian nationalism. And it's an excellent piece. We only have about a 1.5 minute long interview here. I've listened to Catherine Stewart talk about this stuff all day. She's just really, really helpful. So here's that interview.
Let's talk about what Christian nationalism is and let's talk about what it is not. The first thing to know is it's not Christianity or even a religion at all, properly speaking. It's a political ideology. And its representatives insist that the foundation of legitimate government is bound up with a reactionary understanding of the Christian faith. It basically says that the United States is founded on the Bible and that our country can only succeed if it stays true to this foundation. It's also a device for mobilizing and often manipulating large segments of the population by getting them to vote for the political candidates that the movement favors, and basically for creating a new elite, concentrating power in the hands of a new leadership cadre of people who subscribe to illiberal ideologies. It's important to know that it's a leadership-driven movement. It's not sort of bottom-up. It's not driven by the rank and file. It's a top-down movement. Or say something else about what the movement is not. It is not just about evangelicals. I mean, it includes some evangelicals, but it excludes many evangelicals, including some white evangelicals and most evangelicals of color. And it also includes representatives of a variety of both Protestant and non-Protestant religion. Ultra-conservative Catholics, in particular, have become a critical element, and the movement actually even drives support from individuals and groups that do not identify as Christian at all. And what unites them is not a distinct theology, but a common political vision.
Really great, isn't it? Can you just tell you just want to spend time with her thoughts? She really knows it and understands it and takes it seriously. And not only seriously like, oh, it's a real danger to take seriously, but she wants to know the people and what motivates them and moves them, because they're part of our country with all of us. So we need to understand each other, even in our deep, deep disagreements. Another person that does excellent work on this, and especially on this, is the country founded on a Christian notion, is Amanda Tyler, who runs, the CEO of a group called, or the executive director, pardon me, of Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty. Now, if you don't know about the American Baptists and the progressive wing of the Baptist faith through the American Baptists, the ones who did not go along with the Southern move to support slavery, then you see something like Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, and you might think one thing. They are progressives trying to keep Christianity out of our public spheres in ways that would be inappropriate. That's the work that they do. Amanda Tyler's the executive director. They started an effort called Christians Against Christian Nationalism. They kind of work on the mainline Protestant church side, and we work on the evangelical church side, and we do a lot of things together. We're real partners. They helped us on the curriculum. We travel together. We do all this kind of stuff. So we're very much in their world, and Amanda is a real leader. I'll say this. Amanda is a lawyer. Their whole group are lawyers. They do lawyerly work in Washington, D.C. They approach this question of, is the country have Christian nationalist intentions at its founding, like lawyers. So what did they do? They made a statement, a sign-on statement, right? It's a great way to respond. You need all the ways. We don't have a problem that needs to be solved. We have a grand predicament that requires multiple responses. Everybody needs to do all of their things. They have a terrific statement. You can use it, you can download it, you can share it, you can ask people to sign on to it. It's really great. Amanda articulates a bit of that here, so I'd highly recommend that you get connected with the Baptist Joint Committee or their Christians Against Christian Nationalism.org is where you can find that sign-on statement and all. But here's Amanda.
I think that's really a vital point, because we should have a common understanding about what we're talking about as far as Christian nationalism goes. And I'm going to point to the statement that's available at christiansagainstchristiannationalism.org. You know, the work that we did back in 2019 was about providing an advocacy platform for people who were interested in learning more and for taking a public stand. And the centerpiece of the project is a statement. And in the statement itself, we define Christian nationalism as a political ideology that seeks to merge our identities as Americans and Christians. So a few things here. You know, one, we are specifically talking in the American context. This is something that comes up. This is not particular to the United States, but in our work, we are really focusing on the American expression of Christian nationalism. And so we talk explicitly about American and Christian identities. But we also want to distinguish that Christian nationalism is not Christianity. Christian nationalism is a political ideology. Christianity is a religion. That said, you can't totally divorce Christianity out of it. It'd be great just to say, oh, this has nothing to do with Christianity. That would be really easy, right? That's not accurate. And that's because Christian nationalism uses the narratives and the symbols, and in some cases, even the theology of Christianity to further this political ideology. But as we define Christian nationalism, it is not itself a religion. It is more about identity than religion in a lot of ways. And we get at this in one of our resources that we have available at Christians Against Christian Nationalism, a really handy one-pager that your guests last week, Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry, helped us put together called What is Christian Nationalism? And we talk about how it's more identity than religion. When we define Christian nationalism, I think it's also important to say what it's not. It's not patriotism. Patriotism is a love of country, and we can show our love of country in a number of different ways. We can wave an American flag, we can protest in the streets, we can exercise our constitutional rights, right? These are all different ways to be patriotic. Nationalism is a love of country that also requires an allegiance to it above everything else, including our theological views. And so when our theological view, when our patriotism starts to ask us to sacrifice our theological views, that's no longer patriotism, that's nationalism. And particularly as we're talking about here, Christian nationalism.
Really great, huh? Yeah, I think it's really powerful. Okay, so some people come from this founding of the country piece. If that's something you've got going on in your world or people and you're feeling that argument all the time, go to Christians Against Christian Nationalism, get into the work that Catherine Stewart has done, and there's many, many resources about that piece of the argument. But then there's another stream that comes in, it's my fifth metaphor for this thing, another stream that flows into the bay, and that is the language confusion between church and people. Some people end up just talking like Christian nationalists and then taking on Christian nationalist views because they just kind of conflate church and people. Now, I've been a pastor for a long time, I know some of the rest of you are too, and our profession loves to remind the people in our congregations that the church isn't a building, right? The church isn't an institution. The church is what? The people. So you take the church is really the people, and who's the real government in the United States? It's we the people. So who's the government? The people. Who's the church? The people. The church and the people. Right? So you start to see this real comfortability, and you heard it in Representative Flores' comments. Now, I've watched them many, many times, so I'm, dicing them up like I'm on a cooking show, right? And sort of pulling them out and paying attention to them. But she's like, yeah, the church knows the people better, and the people are the things that are represented, and the people should be for God, and therefore the church. That clip you saw in the beginning segment where you saw Representative Boebert giving the sermon, she said, I'm sick and tired of this separation of church and state stuff. That was from a sermon that she gave about 3 months ago at Cornerstone Church in Colorado. I've watched the entire sermon. This is one of those 1 minute or one sentence, 1 word, 10 word, 100 word moments. We're going to watch a little bit more of that sermon where she says this in it, but I want you to see how she gets into it and how she gets out of it and what the motivation for it was, because it's really illustrative of this. And my guess is you also know people who treat the text and some of the conversation very similarly to what she does. And I think this will be helpful, sort of take a moment and watch how it goes, because you'll end up in a conversation or even in your own thinking, kind of moving these words around and not knowing quite how to respond to them. Now, she is in a church context. Some of you will be like, you can say that stuff in a church? What she's saying in a church? Like she's a politician speak? Yep, you can say that stuff in a church as a politician. Doesn't violate your 501c. Yep, you can do it. They're not breaking any laws. There's nothing illegal going on here. Parenthetically, the church she's at, the thing she's about to talk to, and the thing people are applauding at the beginning, and the phrase she says at the end where she looks over at the pastor and says, thank you for your boldness, is because that church refused to shut down during the COVID mandates. And the government had to come in and file charges against the pastor. So they're willing to do illegal things at that church, and she actually encourages them to do so in the sermon. But her preaching a sermon as a politician in a church, even calling for political things, doesn't happen to me. A lot of churches don't want to do that, but you can. there's a lot of confusion about that too, right? There's just a lot of confusion about the role of religion and politics and church and some of the rest of it. I'm not advocating your church does that, but what you're about to see, don't get hung up on why are they breaking the law letting her say that. That's just not the thing that's afoot here. That's not the point of all of this, but it could be easy for you to see that. All right, so are any of you pastors or Bible teachers or Bible leader expert types? Okay, just a few of us, because what you're about to see happen with the text here will just, it's a doozy in my view. Like, it's a good conversation to have, and we should have it, so here we go.
Just because it comes from someone who's elected or a bureaucrat doesn't mean that it's right. This isn't about Republican and Democrat. This is about evil and good, right and wrong. And if you go to Esther 4, in verse 14, Mordecai is talking to Esther, and he says, "For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish." Mordecai is telling Esther, if you remain silent, if you don't show up to your board of county commissioners, if you don't show up to your school boards, if you don't let your elected representatives know what's on your mind, deliverance will come at some point from another place, but not from you. And you will be stuck in that bondage and suffer and perish because of it. The dreams and the gifts and callings that God has on you will remain dormant. If you are silent, you lose by default. That's why I run my mouth often and give God glory. I don't want to lose by default. I don't want to be disqualified. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Now, we could take that scripture and make it really cliche. It sounds really pretty and it looks really good on the front of a notebook. But this is powerful because you are called to the kingdom for this time. And you are called to be bold, to go out with power. You are anointed to set at liberty the captives. Esther had that revelation. She said, I won't remain silent. In fact, I will go to the king, which is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. The reason we had so many overreaching regulations in our nation is because the church complied. The church is supposed to direct the government. The government is not supposed to direct the church. That is not how our founding fathers intended it. And I'm tired of this separation of church and state junk that's not in the Constitution. It was in a stinking letter, and it means nothing like what they say it does. I will go to the king, which is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. I will open my church and allow my people to assemble, which is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. I will not mask our children in school, which is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. Thank you for your boldness.
Okay, all right, so a lot going on there, right? Yeah, you know, more than this, but not all that many, right? Yeah, no, I hear you, yeah. Yes, it amplifies. We just all assume, right, that she's, yeah, no, totally. That's a lot of people when they watch this clip are like, oh, hang on a minute. Okay, so there's not that many people in the room. But they're fervent about this idea, right? They rise to their feet about this idea. There's some passion around this idea. So much going on. The government is not supposed to direct the church. The church is supposed to direct the government. That's how the founders set it up. The founders set it up as we the people, and because you're in church, you can say church and people interchangeably like they're synonyms, so therefore you can say, and this is where it starts. This is how people start to think and believe that separation of church. Because you're saying that people can't be Christian in America? If you've heard someone say to you, what you Democrats, liberals, people that went to that seminar on, confronting Christian nationalism, what you are saying is that you can't be Christian in America anymore. You're like, no one is saying that. Yes, there was Christmas when Obama was president and they did it in the way. Of course. You're like, how do you think that? Well, because you're saying the church needs to be separate from the government. So you're saying the people can't have influence in our government, so you're saying people need to be silenced. So what's the definition of the church? Well, when we're all sitting around figuring out how we're going to pay for the place and who's going to clean up the kitchen and how we're going to tithe and who's going to do the preaching and who's going to be part of all this, we should say things like, hey, church, hey, y'all, hey, church people, hey, people church, like we're all in, here's the church, here's the steeple, open the doors, where are all the people? There they are, right? It's the church are the people, fair enough. But when you start this conversation, that now starts to loop in church and people, and the church is supposed to be directing the government, well, that's how you end up seeing clips like that. And then there's a lot of people that are like, well, she said it, I guess it's probably true, and here we go. So some people come in accidentally, some people come intentionally through this way. I should just let this pass, but I won't. Whatever she was doing with the book of Esther right there is no point where the book of Esther, Queen Esther says, and it was against the law, so I did it. The book of Esther is not calling for anarchy. It's not saying just violate the law because you hold to a higher law, but that's what Christian nationalism says. And the move from Mordecai says to Esther, maybe you've been called for such a time as this, and that's why you should go to your county commissioners. We're going to get to this in a minute about the connection between the nation of Israel and the United States as being two nations that are uniquely connected. So anything that was said to the nation of Israel is said to the people in the United States. They're indistinguishable. That's what's going on there. When you hear someone say what was said to Esther, what was said in Chronicles, what was said in Nehemiah, then applies to the United States, that's a particular view. That's sort of point number three. That's sort of point number three on all this, that we're going to get to the U.S. as the new Israel. That becomes this whole thing. So she's doing she's working in two streams there. She's got she's fishing in this stream and she's fishing in this stream. So she's working both sides of this kind of argument. So the push to take this thing to the county commissioner's office is real. Nick, who you're going to hear from a little bit later, is from this place in Michigan, where right up in Michigan, they shut down a library because they didn't like the books that were in the library. Because they take what she's saying seriously and they wouldn't fund the library, and the library got defunded, and then Nora Jones, the author, had to come in and give $50,000 to keep it alive until it can get to the next election in November. So people are doing what Representative Boebert is suggesting and saying, I'm like Queen Esther, and I don't want to lose the blessing for me, so I'm going to go to my county commissioner's office. What's the motivation behind all that? You're going to be left behind and you're going to be disqualified. Not is there common good for all of us? Do we all do better when we all do better, and could we pursue the common good for the grace of all? Nope, you're going to get left behind if you don't speak up. So why are people shouting at librarians and taking on school teachers and going into county commissioners' offices? Because there's a whole agenda that's pushing this. When Catherine Stewart said this is a leader-driven thing, she's right. Going around to places and saying, go get them, like Queen Esther, because you're anointed and you don't have to follow the laws. Sometimes when we say we're talking about an entire movement that is insurrectionist defending and law and order attacking, there's not one example of that. It's all over the place in this movement. That you are not held responsible by the same laws that rule everyone else. And yet we're having a conversation in our country about lawlessness. There's a doozy of a sermon. Can you imagine for a moment if a black pastor was saying that to her congregation? You don't have to follow the laws. So there's a lot going on here, and race is an enormously important one of those. Okay, the United States is the new Israel and the Christian use of Jewish texts and stories. This one is huge, as is the one that individuals in their government and what role does the government play. We're going to show you clips that sort of bring both these together. This one about the United States as a new Israel might be new to you. Is anyone familiar with this business? A little bit? How so? What do you know about it? See, your parents hold this view, okay? How are you familiar with it?
I grew up in a
A Jim and Tammy Faye Baker Church. They're into this. How are you familiar with this? Okay, so in the Church of Christ, your family was very much a part of this. There's a lot of people who hold this view that the United States is the new Israel and we should see the United States as new Israel. And people in that big cluster, sort of in that ecosystem, they don't all agree with each other either. They're fighting all the time about this, but they're all part of the same assumption that the United States is the new Israel. When I talk to my friend Adam, who I think is fair to identify, he doesn't self-identify as a Christian nationalist, but I said, here's my definition. Can I assume you that? He said I could. He helped me understand this. He said to me, there's only two nations that have an origin story that come from the divine inspiration of God, that were born out of an idea. The nation of Israel and the United States of America. They're unique in the world's history. Don't particularly believe that's true, but this is how he views the world. They're unique in the world's history. And so these two are doing this thing, but they end up seeing the world like this, where they're indistinguishable one from the other. They're just in parallel. The older, smaller brother and the younger, bigger brother are in this thing together in the family of God. So that which is true of the nation of Israel becomes true of the United States. How does this play out? Well, in all kinds of ways about the future of the United States and others. So sometimes you'll be in a conversation with someone and all of a sudden they start talking about the Jewish rituals that they do as a Christian. You might know of groups where Jewish people become Christians. Jews for Jesus is a famous one of those, completed Jews kind of language. There's also a movement by which Christians start to identify as completed Jews. So what they do is they start using the language, the texts, the symbols, and the tools of Judaism. They have a Seder meal. They use a shofar in Christian worship services. They'll put the nation of Israel flag up in their Christian church. They'll wear a prayer shawl. They'll speak about the tribe of Judah and how they're the new tribe of Judah. All of these things, and it's often blended in with charismatic Pentecostal expressions. And to a lot of people, it can feel like a kaleidoscope. They don't know what's going on. Are these Pentecostal Christians or are they Jews or what? And they're all of that stuff mixed together because the new Israel is connected to the blessings of the previous Israel. If you're looking for symptoms of Christian nationalism, one of those is the overuse or the primary use of Jewish texts. 2 Chronicles 3:12. Is that right? Is that the number? Anybody know? If my people, everybody finish this with me, who are called by my name will humble themselves, return, and pray, then I will heal their land. If you're unfamiliar with that phrase, get familiar with it. It comes from Chronicles, and it's said all the time. So what's the big push? How do we heal the land? How do we make America great? Well, it's by humbling ourselves and praying and national days of prayer and calling for people to the righteousness of God. All of that stuff is what they're up to. This is a flyer poster for an event put on by Michael Flynn, the person who was the former national security advisor and convicted criminal, and Roger Stone and a bunch of other preachers and the Trump sons and others. And they put on these events all over the country. Maybe you know these Great Awakening and these reset events that are going on. Full-on Christian nationalist event. One of these was happening last month up by Rochester, New York. So a bunch of us went and did a counter-protest at it, organized people from around the country, and then I went to the event and walked in and spent some time, and I'm going to show you some clips from this. So they're traveling the country preaching this stuff. Part of the reason I want you to see this is just to see the scene and get close, and also remember, this is us. I want you to see people and not just ideas. I actually had a very pleasant afternoon with many of these people, spent time at the booths and talked to people, and we had a great conversation about the Minneapolis airport with a very nice woman. Talked to one of the guys running security, and we disagreed fully on nearly everything and shook hands at the end and said, hope you have a great day. Like, these are just people, right? They're us, and we're all in this thing together. So I want you to see and vibe some of that. But then also what the people are saying on the stage. And you're going to hear the guy on the stage saying when he was at the insurrection That what he saw there wasn't people doing bad things, he saw people doing good things. And he says, what did I see? A bunch of shofar blowing charismatics. Shofar is the sacred tool for many Jewish communities. And there's a lot else you're going to see in this, because there always is so much when you just sort of get in these videos. So I just had a very pleasant experience with someone, and that's why I say, like, there's just all kinds of people here. It's really something. Here's the thing. There's all kinds of people. This guy in a Let's Go Brandon shirt, which I find to be profane. All right, here we go.
And I waded my way through crowds of hundreds, there must have been 1 million people there. And all I saw was good, wholesome, Walmart-type red state Republicans, shofar-blowing charismatics, and a few oddballs dressed up like soldiers. But they were in the minority.
Talking about the insurrection.
Why would they misrepresent our movement to the point that the Christian leadership in the body of Christ doesn't even know they're slandering their own brethren when they agree with the stupid insurrection narrative? We were there to pray and stand in unity to see a reversal of what we saw as a theft. And I'm telling you right now,
why would they lie on us? In the United States, we tend to have this belief that there's 3 roles you could play, one of 3 roles: hero, villain, or victim. Rarely do we see ourselves as the villain, no matter what. Here you have a thing where, like, hey, we were just there to pray for something. We thought we were trying to make things right. Why are they lying on us? Why are they doing all of this? So there's an entire remaking of the story going on, a new narrative that's being told. Human beings are narrative characters. We tell stories to each other. We find ourselves in the story. I have a friend that wrote a really great book. His name's Brian McFarlan. It's called The Story We Find Ourselves In. You should pick it up sometime. It's great. Just the title's great. What story do we find ourselves in, right? Where are we in all of this? They're re-narrating a story. The guy says, I was there. Here's what so now they have an eyewitness. Like, a whole lot going on for the bunch of shofar-blowing charismatics. I'm not saying that everybody who sees the United States as the new Israel is a Christian nationalist. No, of course not. Not at all. There's many people I know who are they do seders and they do prayer things, and they're just like, no, we shouldn't have Christian nationalism. But most of the people who are into Christian nationalism also view it that way. So it's that A equals B and B equals C, but A doesn't equal C phenomenon, right? So to make this really clear, I want to show you, this is the pastor of the Church of Representative Flores. So he's talking about his role in her campaign. He's the one that started the Make America Godly Again movement. And you'll see 2 Chronicles on the bottom of that banner. It's code language of how you see things, that we should humble ourselves and God will heal our land if we pray. He's wearing what's a custom as a Jewish prayer shawl. You'll see people with a shofar in there. You'll see people dancing with a Jewish flag outside of the White House and a charismatic expression. So you see sort of all of it together, and you'll hear his expression of how he understands this. You might think he is extreme, but many, many pastors I know would agree with what he's about to say.
You know that Thomas Jefferson said that you couldn't even call yourself a Christian, an American, if you weren't a God-fearing Christian. And we're going to proclaim that this nation belongs to you, God. Like it was founded in 1776, Lord. Lord, we pray for the supremacy of God in this nation again.
How involved do you think someone like you should actually be in politics and in guiding policy?
Oh, I think we need to. I mean, we like I said, this nation was founded under God, and so we've gone away from that. The church has.
But the nation, in the Constitution and in the Declaration of Independence, it doesn't give any partiality to Christianity. In fact, the opposite, right? And how do you reconcile those two things?
There's freedom of religion, but at the same time, they understood that this whole foundation was built on the Word of God. If we understood, they don't want to force it on you, but they understood, okay, this Constitution will be built. They used 27 scriptures to form the Constitution.
But Thomas Jefferson, who you quoted on stage to your audience, he's very much the one that believed in the separation between church and state. So again,
But you know what? It's funny because that separation of church always comes up, but it was never a law. And that's the thing, like as a pastor, I just wanted to, you know, to tell pastors, it's okay to talk about politics in your church. You won't get in trouble.
Thank you, Jesus.
In Cabrera's view, Mayra Flores is the beginning of something much bigger.
Thank you, Jesus. And devil, we're going to kick you out. Kick you out of our cities, kick you out of our states, and kick you out of this nation, and kick you out of that White House in the name of Jesus.
When you say something like the states belong to Judah or the states belong to Christianity, is that not dangerous?
How am I being a danger to society if I'm preaching what the Bible teaches and all we want to do is just...
Politicians are elected to serve the people, right? To serve everybody, not to serve a God.
Yeah, but hold on, but we are electing them. So they're representing us.
And there's also Muslims that elect them. And
exactly.
I mean,
so that's what I'm saying. So now as a voice, as a church, we have a right to vote for whoever we want to vote for. So, but if we don't use that voice, then what's the point then? Then we're not doing our jobs as Christians to vote for people that have our values. When you're born again, like your mentality changes. I don't think like a Latino no more. I think like a man of God.
Are there any candidates that Make America Godly Again has endorsed?
Mayra was just the beginning. It was just, I mean, she opened a door for other people to walk through.
I mean, you yourself were there during her inauguration.
Exactly.
And if I remember correctly, you told Speaker Pelosi that you wanted to take this country back for God.
That's right. And that was, let me tell you, it was, if I died today, it was worth it.
From the United States Capitol.
There's a lot going on there, right? Okay, that's an expression that a lot of people, when I watched it, I was just, you know, mouth open and like, I can't believe they're just saying it this clearly. And I know a lot of other people who watched that and said, finally, the media is telling the truth about what we need to hear, right? So I think it was disturbing. Other people are like, there we go. Now the media is telling the truth. Yeah, did you have a comment?
Oh, I was just thinking, I mean, is there any thought about the current recent rise of Christian nationalism and tolerance that we have for bullshit and standing for the truth perpetuated by this president?
I think there is. In a moment, I'm going to suggest some of the things I think have caused this particular outbreak. You know, it might be a bit, not overuse the COVID metaphor, but finding, you know, the one originating place might be a little hard, but there's a pretty good idea of where it came from. And we're going to get to that in a minute because it's really about power. I'll just tell you that in my view, it's about the Trump administration used Christian nationalist rhetoric to message to Christian nationalists in a way that most of us never understood it. I mean, you might think, I don't even know who Ben Carson is. Ben Carson, the HUD secretary? What does that matter? I don't know who Betsy DeVos is, the Secretary of Education. I don't know who that is. Never really even heard of Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State. Don't know who he was. Jeff Sessions, maybe I kind of heard of Jeff Sessions because maybe he's a senator. And I don't know, I got up early and watched the news on Sunday mornings on those days, you know, I watched it before I went to church. Or, Michael Pence. I didn't know who Mike Pence was, the governor of some state. I don't know those people. If you're Christian in this tradition, you know all those people. They all come from your background. They're all people of your Christian expression and a whole lot more. So we're going to get to that in a minute because that's what did it. For 4 years, Christian nationalists said, our people are in power. And we'll get to this in a moment. It's the role of the United States in God's plan. It's something that's often referred to as the Seven Mountains movement. And that's what it was about. So when they had power and then lost it, now the concern is, how did we lose it? We couldn't have lost it, honestly, because God wouldn't have allowed that. They must have stolen it from us because they cheated God. Okay? Because the belief is that this administration was put in place for divine purposes. Now, you might think I'm overstating, so I want to show you a couple of clips where people say that very thing, including some of those people that I was just referencing you to. So this brings us then to this notion, this is the fifth stream, which is the seven mountains thing. Anyone familiar with this phrase at all? Have you ever heard it? Okay, this is a doozy. The metaphor is Moses goes up on the mountain and receives the call of God and the commandments, and Mount Sinai becomes a significant place of holiness and leadership for the nation of Israel. So in this theory, there's not one mountain, there are 7 mountains of cultural influence. So what you want to do in this movement is to put Christians, right kinds of Christians, all over the world in arts and entertainment, business, education, family, government, media, and religion. The way you're going to impact the world and the future of the world so the kingdom of God can be at hand in the world is to put Christians of significant influence in all of those sectors. Or people who are ordained by God to do Christian purposes in power in all of those sectors. Because it's not really about the individual and their own faith, it's really about, are they called and anointed by God to be a leader in those spaces? Now that language, called and anointed by God, might not be language that you use, or if you do, it may only happen at an ordination ceremony or something like that for someone in the ministry. But there's a whole tradition that uses this extremely effectively. Was there a hand that was about to pop up? Yeah. Well, the whole scripture, so the people who are big into this, I won't spend too much time sort of doing their bidding for them, but they would say the entirety of the scriptures are telling us this over and over. So it's not one, it's all of them. Jesus goes into a town and says, call out for a person of peace, and if your shalom is returned to you, then go and stay with them. Find the person of influence in the town. When you go into a town and you preach to people and they hear your message, good. If not, knock the dust off your feet because there's no one there for you. So go find the person of prominence and power. Jesus was funded by the women who sold purple cloth, and they funded his ministry. So there's business. Like, it's just all over the place to them. If you take this as your lens by which you see the world, then you start seeing the scriptures through the same lens. So they're not just making it up in their minds. They're seeing it in action. When I went into the other side of that tent, so I went in one door and then I went in the other side of the door. We're going to show you this little video clip. And yeah, remember, this is the one that's real quiet, so we got to give it a little boost. I shot this video and then it's right side up when we watch it, but when I put it into the keynote thing here, it's all upside down. And I kind of like that because that's sort of how I felt when I walked in over there. It was like, it's Alice in Wonderland, and I was sort of spinning. So I walk in, and what you're going to hear him say, if you can hear him, is it's not about is the person a Christian or not, it's about if they're anointed by God. And he makes a disparaging comment about Jimmy Carter, who I thought was a good president. But anyway, here we go.
Walking into the doesn't even know the Lord. Great awakening. Because all the Christians, if you ever talk to Christians during an election cycle, here's what they care about. Is he a Christian? Is he a Christian? They want to know if their candidate's a Christian. Is he a Christian? Let me tell you something. One of the worst presidents we ever had was Jimmy Carter, and he was a Christian. The question you should be asking isn't, is he a Christian? You should ask, is he anointed and chosen by God for the job?
So it's not about the faith of the person. It's, are they anointed and chosen by God? In other words, are they one of the chosen anointed ones in the 7 mountains of influence? Right? So if you're like, why would those people vote for that guy? He's nothing like them. I don't want to sound like that preacher in the tent, but seriously, wrong question. We should all be voting for people that aren't like us if they care about the common good and they want to put everybody in an inclusive situation. It doesn't matter if they're my faith, my part of town, your part of town, wear the stuff I wear, or don't wear the stuff. That's not my point. We should all be saying, don't worry if the person's a Christian if you're going to elect them. I think the question is not, are they anointed by God, but do they care about the common good? Do they want to make sure we all do better? So we all do better? Do they want to make sure that there's a more equitable country? There's another narrative. Nick's going to remind us of that at the end. There's another narrative, not if they're anointed by God, unless you see the world through a 7 mountains view. And then the only thing that matters is, are they anointed by God? So how do people know if they're anointed by God? Well, the stuff they do. When Jeff Sessions got in front of a camera, I about lost my mind, and I think made my first TikTok about this. And he came out as a representative of the United States government, as the Attorney General and the Chief Law Enforcement Officer of the United States, and said, we're going to move to a family separation policy on the border as a warning and as a threat to families who come here that they'll be separated from their children. And he defended it by saying this.
And I would cite you to the Apostle Paul and his clear and wise command in Romans 13 to obey the laws of the government, because God has ordained the government for his purposes. Orderly and lawful processes are good in themselves. Consistent, fair application of law is in itself a good and moral thing, and that protects the weak. It protects the lawful. Our policies that can result in short-term separation of families is not unusual or unjustified.
So there you have it. Now that second part, the middle part, he said that laws should be followed. Yep, I wish Lauren Boebert would have quoted that in her sermon. She chose something else. Yeah, we should have laws and we should follow them. Where does the root of that come from for the United States government? Not from Romans 13 and the Apostle Paul. That's not where it should come from. And to my other activist, Christian activist friends and spiritual activist friends, we shouldn't call on our government to care for the poor because Matthew 25. That shouldn't be the government's motivation. The scripture should not be our government's motivation. It should be our motivation to run for office. It could be your motivation for voting for someone. But the government needs to have other motivations beyond the teachings of any scripture for us to have a nation by which everyone can participate. This is part of what we have to figure out in our civic society. How do we do this? So we shouldn't just condemn the side that says Romans 13 or 2 Chronicles and then praise the side that says Matthew 25. It's not about which passage are we picking. It's about we don't root our laws in our scriptures in the United States. We need to have additional authorities. And we might decide as a country that there's some things that correspond between those, and that's what leads to. But if you don't have another rationale other than your scriptures, you shouldn't be saying it, and you shouldn't be putting it into law. Jeff Sessions should not be standing up there saying, hey, if y'all got a problem with this, you need to pay attention to Romans 13, because these people shouldn't be coming here because they're violating our law. So if they violate our law, then any punishment we give them, even separating them from their children, well, that's just fair game because the Apostle Paul said so. I'm big into the Apostle Paul personally. I really like the Apostle Paul. I think it's great advice. I like a lot of the stuff he says. I think it's profitable for teaching and for correction and for training in righteousness. And a lot of it's very useful. It's not good for setting immigration policy in the United States. That's not what he intended to do, and we shouldn't use it for that. But these are sorry for yelling at you there. I got a little preachy. But that's the stuff that I think we have to figure out how to talk about. And I want to show you this interview on Christian Broadcasting News with Mike Pompeo, when Mike Pompeo was the Secretary of the Secretary of State. Thank you. Not the State Secretary. The Secretary of State. This one's a doozy.
There he is. You doing well? Walking firmly through the door, Mike Pompeo is a determined man. Both our Jerusalem Bureau Chief Chris Mitchell and I had the opportunity to interview the Secretary of State. It was part politics, part policy, and part spiritual, especially for a strong Christian who experienced a refreshing in the Holy Land.
Could it be that President Trump right now has been sort of raised for such a time as this, just like Queen Esther, to help save the Jewish people from an Iranian menace?
As a Christian, I certainly believe that's possible. It was remarkable. So we were down in the tunnels where we could see 3,000 years ago and 2,000 years ago, if I have the history just right, to see the remarkable history of the faith in this place and the work that our administration has done to make sure that this democracy in the Middle East of this Jewish state remains. I'm confident that the Lord is at work here.
Maybe it doesn't strike you, maybe it does. Well, as a Christian, I certainly believe that it's possible that that's why Donald Trump was elected to be the Queen Esther of our age. If you're a Christian nationalist that holds the 7 mountains, you're like, there's my guy. So there's a whole other conversation set going on. And then our administration, I think, is really the work of the Lord. There are things that, it's fine, I'm not telling Mike not to believe that stuff. Mike can believe that, it's great. That's not the stuff you say as the Secretary of State. It's not the position of the United States of America. This is what we all have to get good at. And frankly, Christian nationalists and non-Christian nationalists are not good at it. All right, so let's take a break here for just a couple of minutes for a little debrief and conversation about all of that, because that was a lot, huh? There's a doozy. And then we'll talk about what churches can do, what individuals can do, and then we're going to be serenaded and and a little poetry. Anybody with something you just feel like you got to say? Please. So he's saying, hey, you know what, we're live streaming, so I'm going to have you come up here and just say it real quick. And I know I don't follow this rule, but, like I say to my kids, do as I say, as brief as you can.
Okay. One of the things that's very interesting about it is just the nature of the anti-Semitic, Semitic, yeah, just that whole, this, to me, there's this, I guess, dichotomy kind of running on at that point, which is just something I wanted to comment on. The other one, if you don't mind, okay, it kind of bothers me as a historian, is that the abolitionist constantly referred to higher law, and they were constantly doing that, and they thought they were doing God's work. And it bothers me because in some ways, I think in some ways they were, where I don't think these people are, but I think that same feeling is going on right now. So anyway.
Really insightful. Thank you so much for those comments. Look, a lot of people are confused because they're like, but I hear this anti-Semitic stuff, anti-Jewish stuff going on in white nationalism. But then I see the Christian nationalists that are carrying Jewish narratives and going to Jerusalem and at the wall. Like, what's going on? Yeah, because white nationalism is not the same as Christian nationalism. They're like, you look under your desk and you see all the cords that are all tangled up, and you don't know which one's coming. They're all plugged into the same source. They're all under there in that thing together. But don't make it so simple as simply to say white nationalists are Christian nationalists are white nationalists, Christian nationalists hate minorities. It's not true. That's just not, it's not that simple. There is some correlation, but it's more complicated than that. So just know that we have a series of compounding issues, comorbidities, we might call it, in a virus world, right? There's a number of situations that are all going on in our country at the same time, and it's really hard to suss them out. My advice is believe people when they tell you things, even if you find it a little hard to believe. Like if someone says, I'm not a racist, start with the assumption they're not a racist and see if they can hold that idea, right? But don't assume like, well, that's what every non-racist says, or every racist, right? Like it's just a lot of work to build some deep empathy in this thing. And then there was the comment about history, and it was brilliant. And I forgot what it is. Okay, did you still want to say something? You sure? Okay, all right. Okay, what can churches do? A couple of examples. I think we need to figure out how to break the power of the no-talk rules in our society in our churches about government, politics, and faith. I'm not saying churches start advocating for politicians. We got enough work to do before we get to that. We don't know how to talk about politics. We don't know how to talk about the government. We don't know how to talk about how to have civic life. This question of, were the abolitionists right when they were calling to a higher calling? I think they were, because that's what motivated them, and then they called the government to fulfill the government's obligation. Here's what made Martin Luther King Jr. so genius. He said his faith calls him to act, and the United States promise needs to be fulfilled because it's been a bounced check, a bounced promissory note. So what he was able to do was talk about his motivation from his faith, and then call the government to fulfill its motivation that it has in its own government promises. We should figure out how to make a distinction between those. We should help people do that. We're not good at it in this country, and we're just getting worse at talking about a lot of these issues, and we have no talk rules. I mean, there are places in churches where if you want to talk about, like, how do we get involved in civic life for the government, people would be like, okay, let's not talk about that now. Let's just talk about sex like you never wanted to talk about, or let's talk about some other thing we don't talk about before we get to that. If the American church went to family therapy session, the therapist would lean back or lean in and say, you all got to figure out how to break the no-talk rules here, because it's not working for you. There's a lot we have to do. Anybody that's been in a situation where you have to break habitual habits of what you won't deal with in a relationship or with people, is the first thing is to say, we got a problem and we have to figure out how to talk about it, right? If you've been in therapy, maybe in a relationships, a lot of great therapists will suggest spend 3 weeks, 2 months, just saying to each other, there's something we got to talk about. We're not talking about it yet, but we need to talk about it. Let's get comfortable. with needing to talk about it before we jump in. Get people to the point where it's like, hey, this one's uncomfortable. And you don't talk about everything in every setting. I've been a pastor for a long time. We've all maybe been the people in a church meeting where you're like, hey, by the way, if we still got a minute, I kind of want to bring up the thing about the garden out there. I want to bring up the thing in the budget, or can we talk about the kitchen? And you're like, no, we can't do that in this meeting. Let's set another meeting for that, which is kind of a leader's way of never talking about the thing. We don't want to do that. So I get it. Whatever goes on in that room over there and whatever version of church you're in, the sanctuary, might not be the place to talk about it. Sermons might not be the place to talk about it. Sermons tend to be more like tonight, one-way communication tools, speeches put together under the guise of preaching. Find another way to talk about it. We can do this as an American populace and break those no-talk rules and engage and talk about it. So that's something I think that churches absolutely need to do, because we can't keep going with we just don't talk about Bruno around here. If you don't know that song, you should. The other thing, we can educate ourselves on this and learn how to break the no-talk rules. When you're going to start talking about something that you haven't talked about before with people that matter to you, don't just say like, okay, you go first. Like, get yourselves ready, because you don't yet know how to talk about it. That's why you're not talking about it, right? The other thing a good therapist will tell people in a conflicted relationship is develop some new skills to utilize, because your old skills got you to this place. This is a great book, Jesus and John Wayne. It's written by Kristen Dumais, How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation. It's even more than that. What's going on is this whole notion. And here's Kristen. Here's some graded. It's not really advice. It's sort of setting the context for churches and what's going on in churches. And she knows a lot of them all over the country.
What I'm seeing right now, a couple of different things. This rift is real, right? It's real. It's cutting through families. It's cutting through communities, through churches. That people who thought they shared the same faith are now looking at each other across this chasm, saying, "Who are you?" Right? And what? How can you say these things? And realizing maybe that similar religious language has papered over these really incredible differences for a long time, and that just can't be ignored. So what we see happening is, I think Ed Setzer called it the evangelical reckoning, where we do see a number of evangelicals saying, no, this is not my faith. This is not, and now that I see it clearly, oh, we need to talk. This is not my Christianity. This is not my gospel. This is not my Jesus, right? And this is not my country. And so trying to change that, to stand out against it. And we see a lot of people leaving churches. We see people, some pastors getting fired, employees of Christian organizations either getting forced out or just walking away. That is very real, and it's happening. So the evangelical reckoning is happening on an individual level. What I also see is it's not happening much at all on an institutional level. And so when you have people, individuals leave organizations, leave churches, when you have Beth Moore leave the SBC, and this is being repeated on the local level all over the country right now, enough is enough, or you get fired. Who remains, right? The people who remain are often more radicalized. The voices of dissent are removed, and they can go on with what they're doing. And so I see both of those dynamics at play right now. A number of people who had kept quiet for a very long time, who had been complicit in many ways in allowing things to get to where we are now, are saying enough is enough, and there are all kinds of individual acts of courage. And at the same time, I see that institutions are really persisting in these spaces, and in some ways, radicalizing.
The power of institutional response to civic problems is significant. Institutional racism is a phrase a lot of us have come to understand, because you have to deal with it at that level. And I think it's something similar in this. I'd also suggest that churches can make it about faith and not about politics. It's a really good way to do it, because that's one of the things we do as churches, is we say there's a part of our lives that we really want to focus on around here, right? It's your faith. And how do you talk about this as a faith-related effort? If you don't already know a person named Shane Claiborne, he does a lot of work in this area. This is a good book on this topic called Jesus for President, Politics for Ordinary Radicals. That's one you might like if you're into this sort of thing. And he's got a great comment here about this. And he actually is talking about Kristen Dumais' work in it as well.
I think that the beginning of it is to identify this collusion of the religion, the heretical religion of American nationalism with Orthodox, authentic Christianity. And the fact is, in Jesus and John Wayne, Kristen does it so well. She shows us that, the problem is not that Americans think John Wayne is the Messiah. It's that they wish the Messiah looked a little bit more like John Wayne than the historical Jesus. We don't really want a cross. We've got a gun. And if Jesus had had a gun, he might not have gotten killed. I literally saw that on a bumper sticker with the flag, right? So I think that's where we've got to identify that the religion of American nationalism has its own theology, manifest destiny, the doctrine of discovery, right? The religion of America has its own liturgy, its own holidays, its high holy days, July 4th. It's got its own creeds. We hold these truths to be self-evident. It's got its icons and symbols, the flag, the national anthem is its worship song. And if you disrespect it, you're in trouble. So we've got to bounce all of that off of Jesus and off of the real gospel. And I think we literally have a choice. As Jesus said, we can't serve two masters. We've got to decide who we will serve.
So what he's getting at there is this notion that, look, don't conflate the two religions together. Let the governmental thing do its deal. It's got a whole system. You start blending those together and putting those flags inside of the Christian spaces, and now we're blending these together in a way that just hasn't served anyone well in this country. So can we make it about faith and then be able to approach our government in a way that's going to be helpful? Look, we know there's Christian candidates running all over and people that are in Christian. My representative in Congress is Ilhan Omar, and she's a Muslim. And yeah, there's people that are religious and they really care about their faith. Some don't at all. Some do. That's just all part of it. But what they're joining together in is this other activity of caring for the entire country. That's what they're caring about. Here's a nice little piece, a nice little book from a person named Brian Zahn, Postcards from Babylon. You might really like this. That's Brian. I'm not going to show you that one tonight, just for time. We should also be honest about the practices that subtly support the notions of Christian preference in our society. Christianity gets a pass and a starting point on a lot of things. We have chaplains in our government, in the Senate, in the House, and all these places. As a Christian minister, I am given the authority to stand in front of a couple and say, therefore, by the authority vested in me as a minister of the gospel, I pronounce you husband and wife. What's going on here? I can't go to your house closing and be like, hey, congratulations, you're closing on your house, just here to sign off on that, on that purchase agreement. But we do it in weddings that then we say are some. So there's a lot of things going on. A lot of people go to the hospital and don't have to pay for their parking. Let's just recognize it and name it, that Christianity is getting a lot of preference in our society. Before we start only talking, what this is all going to do is get us to a place where we can start talking about this stuff and not just be like, those people and those sermons are the ones. We're all in this thing together. Our DNA is all over this crime scene, all of us. We're all in on the deal. And what can individuals do? I would suggest these two things, empathy and engagement. Empathy is not sympathy, right? Empathy is understanding from somebody else's perspective how and why it makes sense to them. There are three great questions you can always ask someone. I think the third is significant for this conversation. What do you believe? Great question. Why do you believe it? Terrific. What does it do for you? That's a different question. How does it function in your life? How does it serve you? What's going on with you, and how is this beneficial to you? How is your believing this the best choice you can be making today? Because people believe it is. When you believe something, it seems to make all the sense in the world, almost no matter what it is. And we all know that we believe just unbelievable stuff about ourselves and one another, right? We all know how we talk to ourselves about ourselves, right? We got stuff going on in our heads that make no sense to us at all. We can't even figure out our own thinking. So people believe things because it makes sense to them. And then we just need to engage. know someone, meet, or know someone who's doing something, or use some organization as a surrogate, or some other way to be involved. Show you 2 quick clips from a person named Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove, wrote these 2 great books. I hope you'll pick those up. Reconstructing the Gospel, Finding Freedom from Slaveholder Religion, mind-bending, and Revolution of Values, Reclaiming Public Faith for the Common Good. No affiliation to Vote Common Good. We don't use the in front of common good. So that's how you can tell the difference. And here's John. Jonathan works really closely with the Poor People's Campaign, Reverend William Barber. So if he seems familiar to you, that might be how you know him.
Yes, indeed, because you can't assume that the people who believe this are crazy in their context. But again, back to the empirical data that they were just laying out, there's far too many people to think that this is just, some sort of aberration that needs to be treated in individuals. No, this is a culture that is feeding people lies, reinforcing those lies, and inviting people to understand themselves as part of what I think people of faith, Christians, can only call an idolatrous worship of the nation as the kind of ultimate end. And the alternative to that has to be building a better community to invite people into. And I think, while we need to be building culture in all kinds of ways everywhere, any strategic effort to address this has to especially focus on building community in rural places, and in particular in places that have been media deserts, because that is where, to get into the weeds a little bit, the Council for National Policy that I mentioned has had the executive leadership of all of those media companies that Sam mentioned, from American Family Radio to Breitbart News to Fox. They've all been on that council. They've all coordinated with each other for decades. And what they have done is they have strategically gone into places where there are not local newspapers anymore, where there's not local radio, and they have blanketed it with their message. So it's entirely possible, if your pastor participates in the Family Research Council's pastor program and takes their free literature, and if you are a member of the Republican Party and the NRA, which by the way have also coordinated very closely with this group, and if you listen to American Family Radio when you're driving the tractor out in the field, it's entirely possible that you never hear any other narrative in your life, right? There is no alternative in the place where you are. And so you would be crazy in that context not to believe this stuff. So I think anybody who knows that this is a lie has a moral obligation to try to enter these spaces and interrupt the wraparound culture that has been created by this propaganda campaign.
So good, isn't it? All right, just one more little clip from Jonathan.
Let me say this. I think what you're talking about on the first point, in terms of really challenging churches that we may be part of or may be connected to in some way, the challenge that I think is most important is the challenge to get involved, right? Too often what they were describing as ambassadors are those Americans who participate in Christian congregations who are not all that enthusiastic about the agenda of the religious right, but have basically decided that it's most comfortable for them if they don't challenge it too directly, and if they more or less talk about Jesus in a way that Jesus assures you some eternal salvation and some peaceful life for you and your family in this world. That's kind of the Jesus that has been preached. And I'm not just saying on the sort of theologically conservative side of things. There's a lot of mainline white congregations that might be theologically liberal, but more or less still preach a Jesus that just lets you be more or less comfortable. And I think it's time to reclaim the Jesus who disturbs the peace. You can't read the Gospels too honestly without recognizing that while many of the poor and marginalized people whom Jesus embraced and affirmed were very enthusiastic about his presence, but almost anybody who had any power in that society looked at the brother sideways and in the end tried to kill him. That's the response people had to Jesus, because Jesus said, the kingdom of God is at hand. The kingdom of God, while not a partisan organization, is certainly a political entity, and I would contend that it challenges any party within any political system of this world.
All right, so we hope some of that you find helpful. I think it's pretty great. There's people who are thinking about this. We're not alone. We're all in on it together.